Hi everybody, welcome to Sunya IAS and welcome to Forestry Optional. This is lecture 1 which is about the introduction to forestry and silviculture. Okay, I hope all of you would have already seen the orientation lecture wherein I've just talked about the various aspects of forestry. Okay, before I start, in every lecture I'll tell you what are the topics we're going to cover. In this we will be telling you how to define forests, right? What are the benefits of forest? Okay, in fact on the benefits of forest questions have already been asked. I will also link the state of the words forest 2022 report. Okay, we will be talking what is forestry. Okay, in that we will be seeing the different types of forestry, for example social forestry, urban forestry, right? Protection forestry. We will be telling or discussing what is silviculture. Okay, so definition of silviculture, how like what are the objectives it aims to achieve. Okay, and a big portion of this will also be talking about classification of forest, because you have read about, let's say, the Indian State of Forest report. Okay, you also have, let's say, read about the Indian Forest Act of 1927. So there are different ways in which forests are classified. Okay, so we will be understanding how all of these things are putting in, let's say, putting things into place. Okay, objectives of silviculture and of course applications also of silviculture we will understand. Fine. And in the last part, I will link all of this with climate change. Okay, wherein I talk about the deforestation. Okay, vast amounts of forest being degraded, and then I will link this to one of two main highlights of this year. One is this report, mainstreaming biodiversity in forestry. Okay, and second is the Seoul Declaration. You might have read about this in your prelims. Okay, this happened in the 15th World Forestry Congress. So overall, these declarations highlight the importance of forest. This you can again link with the benefit of forest, but in the current context of widespread deforestation. Okay, so this is how the lecture is going to be outlined. Fine. Now before I start, and because this is lecture number 1, now you will be covering forestry with me. Okay, so there are a few things I want you to definitely make use of. Number 1, active listening. Okay, in general active listening has to be done in throughout all the lectures, throughout your studies. So merely passively listening to the lecture won't help. Okay, so you might be asking me what should be done. Okay, even if you are watching the lecture, okay, what you should do, you should take active notes alongside. Fine. If there's any time you're not able to understand, of course you can ask that in this handle at forestry_Sunya on Telegram. Okay, I'll be helping you out, but other than that, try to be very active. Okay, the sheer act of writing things down will increase your retention. Okay, right? So the more you engage with the content, the more it stays with you. Second, many of you will ask how to make notes. Okay, should we only rely on the PPT? So I'll tell you, and of course in my environment lectures as well, the PPTs are, let's say, heavy in content. A lot of images are there. So I will say by the end of this, let's say, course, you will have more than thousands or let's say 1500 slides to revise. Okay, so that will be cumbersome, especially when you have the exam and you have limited time to revise. So I will focus, and I will say focus on making short running notes in this. Let's say you made your notes, you always will be getting access to. Again, go back and just add whatever you missed in the class. Okay, so that will help. Second, when you are making notes, please leave some margin. Okay, in many topics I will tell you the bigger topic, so write that topic on the margins. Okay, so you will understand, okay, this particular, let's say, dictation or this particular theme is related to the bigger topic is this. And secondly, if you have some space on the other margins, add some facts or add some case studies. I will be also referring, and my lectures will be very interlinked. Okay, so let's say if I teach you something today, and if I want you to reference that, so you should have some space and you can write, okay, refer lecture number 1 or refer this topic. Okay, so that will be helpful. Fine. So your notes should be dynamic. They should be able to incorporate these elements. And yes, you should definitely make a practice of making these notes. Now, I know many of you will not have a background in forestry, and I'm also not assuming that you are familiar with all the keywords and terms. So in this lecture number 1, there will be some keywords and terms maybe you are not very sure of. And also based on my experience, I have, let's say, known that a lot of students are not also aware about basic terms of forests and forestry. Okay, so to that end, the lecture number 2 is totally about the anatomy of a forest. Okay, it will be a very unique lecture in which every term that you can think of related to forest, crops, plant morphology, how, let's say, what is a dominant, co-dominant, right? Then let's say different terms, what is a seed, what is a sapling, scrub, tree, grass, herb, everything of that sort will be covered in lecture number 2. And also you have to be slightly patient for the, at least for the 3 or 4 lectures that will get your at least basic understanding going. Okay, so that you can follow. Secondly, whatever key terms and examples you are following, I want you to write that separately as well. You have your basic notes. Also have one separate page, write the heading, key terms. So now if I tell what is silviculture, and let's say in this lecture, I tell you the difference between silviculture and silvics, write those terms down. In an, let's say, technical optional, it is always better to have a list of key terms and have good definitions for all of that. Okay, because you are rewarded on the good definitions. Okay, because it's a technical optional, in that you don't have much scope of writing whatever comes to your mind. Fine. So when you have those terms ready and leave some space, for example, in this lecture itself, I will tell you silviculture and I will give you 3 or 4 scholarly definitions. Whatever definition you think is the easiest for you to revise, just write that down. So you have a repository of key terms. Similarly, have a repository of examples or let's say case studies. So from lecture 1 to the lecture last, you will have so many new things. Keep on adding it here. Similarly, you can also create a separate small notebook for diagrams. While all of this will be present in your main notes, but if you are able to segregate this into these parts, you will then see the biggest benefit just maybe 1 or 2 days before the exam. Now, if you just want to quickly go through your diagrams, you have a small, let's say, diagram copy. You can also take snapshots of it. Casually, if you are scrolling, going somewhere, you can just quickly revise your diagrams. Fine. So that is one thing. Okay, so key terms and examples, try to make a note of it. Keep on adding and updating it. If there is any confusion, directly ask me. We will also be having Zoom sessions in which you can get your doubts solved. Now, species name. Okay, and basically I'm talking about the name of the scientific species. Number 1, again, do you have to remember, of course, in paper 1, you also have a silviculture of Indian, let's say, trees, in which 32 such species are mentioned. Basic rule is, one is how you should be writing it. Okay, so let's say if I talk about acacia, okay, nilotica, okay, or it's say if I talk about any other species, let's say Pinus roxburghi, okay, okay, Cedrus deodara. So there are two things. There are two things which I'm saying. Let's say, okay, if I'm saying acacia, let's say nilotica, fine. How should you write it? The first term in this, the first word has to be capital. Leave a space, then write the second word. Here everything is small, please notice, and underline both of them separately. Okay, so it should not be that you just do a single underline for this. Okay, or let's say if I talk of the invasive or exotic species, let's say if I talk of, okay, so notice I have made the P capital, I've made J small, both of them are separately mentioned and both of them are separately underlined. This, start doing it from this lecture itself. In every lecture you will encounter species name, and if you make this writing, okay, if you write it like this, this is how it actually it should be written. Fine. So this is how you write it. Next, with respect to answer writing, now with every lecture I will be, let's say, telling you about previous year questions. In the initial 1 or 2 or 3 lectures, I will focus more on explanation, and after that I will be building on discussing the previous year questions. Now, those of you who are more eager, or let's say you've already given a forestry attempt, or let's say you only want to practice. So based on whatever you know right now on that lecture, try to attempt those. If possible, we'll also discuss it again on Zoom sessions, right? And this silviculture topic is, let's say, broken down into many series of lecture. So after every lecture, your understanding will improve. So let's say if I ask you about a simple question on silviculture, you may be only able to write whatever I've told you in lecture number 1. But let's say after lecture number 10, you have so much of content, your answer will be better. After lecture number 20, better, even better. So this will progress throughout. But don't think that you will be just, let's say, starting to write answers at the very end. Might get limited time. So you can start doing that. If you face any problem here, you can ask. Many of you would have also had the experience of writing civil services mains. You can start perhaps later. But those of you who are very new to the subject and perhaps will be writing their first mains perhaps soon, can start it slowly, step by step. I can also assist you. Every lecture will also be followed by homework. Okay, so whatever I'm telling you, please do that. And this will also help you when you give your forestry interview. Okay, so I will be asking most of the questions which usually the examiners ask you in the interview. So just 10-15 minutes if you spend after the lecture, that will be great. Okay. Also, the moment your lecture ends, try to revise it also in that day or within 1 or 2 days so that it stays with you. And don't have a huge break. Let's say you watch lecture number 1, then 3 or 4. Don't hop between the lectures. It is an interconnected topic. Okay, so follow the sequence which we are telling you. Fine. Do your homeworks, do a bit of answer writing. Okay. And lastly, I think at this point, I've already told you, you will be getting the PPT, handouts, and a lot of things. And even this is enough to score very good marks. Okay, sometimes why students score lesser marks is also because they do not do a lot of this part. Okay, and they are only focused, let's say, on the handout. Fine. So while handouts, everything is there, but I will still encourage that you make your own notes. Okay, this will give you a far better retention. All right. With that said, we will now start. Okay, the topics I think you are already clear to you. Again, this is one, let's say, map we are going to see again and again. This is forestry optional. Paper 1 section A, paper 1 section B, paper 2 section A, paper 2 section B. Okay. We are starting with silviculture general. Okay, this is the topic which we are starting. Now this topic is spread throughout the paper. Okay, and this you will also see in today's lecture as well, that when I discuss silviculture general, I will be referring to silviculture systems. I will also be referring to, let's say, mangroves, silviculture of Indian trees, these portions and these portions. So your superior understanding, for example, when I discuss classification very shortly with you, you will also see that I'm also referring to this. Okay, the forest management part. So there is a certain level of patience which is also required at your end, so that when you cover all of these portions, then you will have a very good understanding. Fine. And this also helps you to locate where you actually are. You are starting here. We'll go through paper 1, section A, section B, 2A, 2B. Fine. So we will be covering these aspects. Okay, so that will be helpful. Again, now, so this is paper number 1. We are doing silviculture general. So always know where you are. So a basic understanding on the syllabus is also needed. Again, the first homework for you is to go through the syllabus and perhaps write it with your own hand. Okay, so that you are aware of at least what are the terms which are there. Fine. Okay, so enough said. Let me start with the lecture. So we are basically talking of forests. Now, why this image? Now, many times, and I think many of us are not even sure how to define a forest in the first place. Fine. So what should be a forest? Just the mere presence of trees, is that a forest? Okay. Sometimes we go to, let's say, a safari to visit a national park, a tiger reserve, and you see a lot of forests here and there scattered. Is that a forest? And sometimes you also would have heard a term known as jungle. So is jungle a forest or is it not? Okay. You also have heard terms like what are trees? Okay, so are trees forests? So there are certain terms and certain, let's say, confusing terms which are always present. Fine. So how can we navigate? And this is how we will start our discussion. So the number one thing which I'll tell you, of course, this is the global distribution of how forests are. Okay. So there are different types. You might have heard about the tropical rainforests, temperate forests, boreal forests. Okay. This is just to show you that there are multiple ways in which there are forests which are classified. Not just this, so this is tropical, temperate. You can also think of evergreen, deciduous, right? Alpine, which is, let's say, if I talk about coniferous forests, okay? I'm not going to explain these terms right now. That will be most probably in the lecture number 2. But still, you would have heard about these things, fine? That there are different terms in which you're defining the forest. This is the classification part of the forest, fine? So basically, how will we, what are then forests? Okay, so the term forests has a Latin origin, okay, and in this it is derived from a Latin word which is known as foris. Okay, so during the medieval times, what used to happen? Let's say there was a piece of land, okay, and that land was, let's say, cleared for any other purposes. Okay, so in the outside boundary, the forests used to be planted. Okay, so let's say if there was a village in the outside boundary, just so as to, let's say, cover it and structure it, they used to plant forests, and those forests were also the source of fuel wood, okay, timber, and these are the products. Okay, so we have been seeing from the very old times, right from the ancient times. In fact, if I go back to Kautilya's Arthashastra, to the Mauryan times, to other times, medieval times, we have seen that forests have played an important role. We'll see what the role is, but overall we have to understand that they were basically, let's say, cultivated or present outside, or let's say to demarcate the boundaries. So this is just a historical reference to how we had forests earlier. Okay, so keeping that in mind, again you would be confused about the terms I have told you, fine? So firstly, we will understand what is the difference between terms which I am telling you. Then we'll see how we define the forests, fine? So here, the first thing which I'll tell you is, of course, one second, yeah, you have a one and you have jungle. Okay, jungle will be the portions, okay, which are basically untouched by humans. So when I'm saying untouched by humans, so of course these are not governed, okay, whereas when I'm talking of forests, so there these are properly governed, scientifically managed, and in fact we'll also see that is what forestry and silviculture is about, the scientific study and the management of forests for their utilization, for management, for ecological and social economic benefits. That is how we understand. So the first takeaway right now is, in terms of jungle, what is this? This is basically something which is untouched by humans. That is the first part that you have to understand. Okay, now things will become more clearer as I go towards the definition part here. Okay, so how can we define forests? So there are three ways in which you can definitely define. One is a legal definition, which is the easiest to understand. Then you have a technical definition in which you will have some keywords, and then there is an ecological definition. Okay. So for the legal definition, what you can understand, any piece of land which is declared, let's say, as a forest in a central law, in a state law, okay, or any local laws. So I'm saying any piece of land which is declared, okay, it may be a forest, it may not be, we do not, let's say, worry about that. This is a legal definition, okay. And now this actually also happens on ground as well. There may be, let's say, if a survey happened 50 years back and that land, or that area was designated as a forest. Now, even though if you visit and you do not see proper, let's say, forests, but still it will be deemed to be a forest because of the legal definition, right? I've again used the term deemed to be a forest. Now, there is a famous Goda Varman judgment, okay, which is related to the areas of Nilgiris and Western Ghats, okay, and in which there are aspects of compensatory afforestation. What is a forest and what will be deemed to be a forest? So there was a legal tussle. By the way, this judgment also came in news this year when the Forest Conservation Rules, or the amendment of it of 2022 came into being, right? So again, in your margins, please write down Goda-Varman judgment. We will read about it in more detail when I discuss forest legislations, a separate topic with you. Fine. But again, this is, you can link this to the legal definition, because this actually is a challenge how to define a forest, because you are right now also seeing there are various ways in which you can define a forest. All right. So what is the legal definition? Any area or any piece of land which is designated as a forest in a central, state or a local law. Fine. Then what is a technical definition of a forest? Okay. And when I tell you this, I will also refer, for example, if we go with Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, okay, and basically I'm talking about, let's say, the Indian State of Forest Report. Okay, in this there are two criterias to designate a land as a forest. So one, it talks about, now these are things you have already studied. I am linking it to make you understand. Okay, this is not the only way to define a forest, by the way. So here there are two things. One, it talks about that the area should be, or the land should be greater than 1 hectare, and the canopy density should be greater than 10%. Now canopy density, mark this as a term. This should go in your terms. Okay. What is a crown? What is a canopy? We'll see it in the anatomy of a forest. But still, if I have to tell you, let's say this is a forest. This portion here is known as the canopy. Okay. You would have perhaps read about in the tropical rainforests, they have very good canopies which are present. However, because of very good canopies, the sunlight is not able to go to the, let's say, ground areas. Fine. So I hope you just, and you don't have to remember all of this right now. I'm just trying to explain it, because for your prelims you would have read about this, that what is a forest. So as per the definition, or as per Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, as per in the Indian State of Forest Report, how you define as a forest: greater than 1 hectare and the canopy density is greater than 10%. Fine. Now you can just write down in the technical definition that it is any piece of land, okay, which is set aside. So you write down any piece of land which is set aside for the production of timber, okay, and other forest produce, okay, which can provide, let's say, benefits to people. Fine. So it would be, and that is a technical definition. It can have various parameters. Let's say for us, the parameter is this: greater than 1 hectare, canopy density. For any other country, the definition can be different. So this is a technical definition, because crown, canopy, etc., these are technical terms. Fine. So legal definition, I hope, is clear to you. Technical definition in which you are setting aside any piece of area for the production of timber and other forest produce. I will also tell you what is a forest produce when I tell you the next topic, that is benefits from a forest. Fine. So I hope you are able to understand this part, right? Now there is a third term which is mentioned here, okay, which is mentioned as the ecological definition. Okay. So herein you have to just write down that this is a second. Let me, I hope you are fine with erasing this. I'll just explain that to you. Yeah. What is an ecological definition? So please write down, it is any uncultivated piece of land. So number one thing is uncultivated piece of land which is having vegetation. Okay. So having natural vegetation, okay, and having a closed or a partially closed canopy. Okay. So uncultivated piece of land which is closed or partially closed canopy, and which of course will provide benefits to the people. So that will be an ecological definition. Fine. And again here in your margins write down champion and state classification. Okay. Again when I discuss the classification of forest, again in the ecological classification we will read about, just a second, champion and State 1968 classification. They've basically divided forest into five broad groups, and within that there are other groups. So total 16 set of forests. So please wait for, I think in the next 15-20 minutes we'll also see what is champion and state classification. So till now we have a legal definition, technical definition, ecological definition, legal definition, any piece of area or which is designated as a forest in a central state or a local law. Technical definition also you have understood. Okay, you are setting aside any area for the production of timber and other forest produce. Okay, and ecological, because see the term is ecological, so it talks about uncultivated area having some natural vegetation with closed or a partially closed canopy. Okay, so please write this down firstly. Okay, this is how we define forests, right? Now there are a lot of acts which govern forests in India. Okay, now this is a separate topic and we will cover this in a lot of detail. This is present in paper 2B. Okay, let me show that to you in the paper itself. Yeah, let's say the forest economics and legislation is a big portion which we cover in paper 2B, that we'll cover. But why am I telling you this? Again, to refer what you already have read. Okay, so let's say if you have Indian Forest Act of 1927, this classifies the forest, and by the way this is before independence, so this classifies the forest into, let's say, reserved forest, protected forests, okay, village forests, etc. Right, that is one. We have national forest policies as well. For example, our national forest policy of 1952 spoke about having forest and tree cover of 33%, right? Similarly, you have Wildlife Protection Act, which again designates conservation reserves, community reserves. Okay, we have a compensatory afforestation fund, which also talks, now this is also a very important, which talks about net present value. What is NPV? NPV basically is, let's say you are cutting a piece of area for a development or a non-forestry purpose, so we calculate a net present value. Okay, so that similar area which has been removing the forest, the same forest will be used in plantation. Okay, again this is NPV is also linked to the Goda Varman judgment. Okay, so this also spoke about it. There is a Forest Rights Act and there is also Forest Conservation Act. There are different acts. The whole idea it was to tell you that yes, there is a forest and there is a tree. There is a difference between both. What is a forest? Greater, at least as per our policies and as per our let's say designation, greater than 1 hectare and canopy density greater than 10%. Fine. There are reserved forest, protected, village forest. We'll also understand this subsequently as well. So I hope the first heading is clear to all of you. What are forests? A definition of a forest. Okay. Now we go to the second part, that is benefits of a forest. Okay. Now benefits of a forest is same in terms of benefits of an ecosystem. So in your basic environment, you know that the ecosystem or any ecosystem provides 4 services: provisioning services, regulating services, cultural services, and supportive services. Now, if you get a question, what are the benefits of a forest? Some of you may write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But it is better if you write them in 4 headings: provisioning, supportive, cultural, and regulating. I'll tell you what this means. Number 1 is provisioning. Provisioning means to provide for. What is the forest providing me? If I cut down the forest, I get timber. I can use it for furniture. Then I can use it for pulp, paper, for bioenergy, for textiles. Similarly, one is timber and other is non-timber forest products or produce. So think of resins. Okay, or not just resins. Think of, in this case, let's say there will be some medicinal or aromatic plants. Okay, so all of that will be your non-timber forest products. Okay, and by the way, when we read, or let's say about these NTFPs, this is again a separate topic in your paper, right? So here when you read about forest resources and utilization, we will read about the NTFPs in a lot of detail. Fine. So even that is a very important part that you should be aware about, right? Okay. So we were discussing, so yes, you have provisioning services, fuel wood, fiber for textile, fruits, nuts, vegetables, so on and so forth. So all these are provisioning, including NTFPs like gums, resins, oleoresins, okay, even essential forest oils also, okay. So let's say UPSC had already asked this, for example, lemongrass oil, which actually repels insects. So even this is a non-timber forest produce, okay. So these are provisioning services. Then supporting services. What is it supporting? Think of nutrient cycle, think of carbon dioxide cycle, think of water cycle. Your environment you have read, there are gaseous cycles and sedimentary cycles. So supportive, so it also talks about primary production, right? Because of photosynthesis, it will generate biomass. So one is primary production, nutrient cycles, water cycle, formation of soil. Now again, we will discuss about soil formation and edaphic factors when I discuss paper 1B. So here forest soils, soil conservation is a separate topic. Here we will read about it in very detail. Fine. Again, how does it support? It supports a lot of biodiversity as well. Fine. So a lot of factors are there for supportive. Then cultural factors. Now think of tribes which are very close. Okay. Think of people who celebrate a lot of festivals with forests. Think of, let's say, the northeast communities, right? So recreation, ecotourism, religious and spiritual. In fact, you would have heard of terms like sacred groves. Okay, right? So that is also there. And last is regulating. So one is carbon sequestration, and again, please write these technical terms. Okay. So in terms of climate, carbon sequestration. What is carbon sequestration? That whatever excess carbon is present, they are going to absorb it. Again, think of photosynthesis. CO2 plus H2O. What does it give you? Glucose, C6H12O6, and oxygen, right? Or now, this is very important, it helps in flood control. Okay, so let's say if you have mangrove plantations across a coast, let's say this is Bay of Bengal, okay. Sundarbans have a very high density of mangrove forests. In fact, the highest mangrove forests are present in Sundarbans. So now if there is a tsunami or if there is a lot of storm water, these mangroves will reduce the impact of disaster. Okay, so again, that's a benefit of a forest. Then erosion prevention also. It again, if you have coastal areas, in coastal areas, because of the energy or the tidal energy of the waves, okay, so there is a lot of erosion which is happening, which is very detrimental. So again, you can prevent erosion if you have proper forests planted, right? Also helps in pest and disease control, and not just that, it also helps you reduce pollution as well. Forests also have this part. We'll also discuss some technical, let's say, important varieties which help you reduce air pollution, noise pollution. You have heard of green mufflers, okay, can be present on, let's say, a highway. And if you have these, let's say, plantations, so that can also muffle the sound, right? So benefits of forest, you should be knowing all the points. So again, a small thing will be after the lecture, try to, if you get this question in an 8 mark, etc., write as many points as possible. Okay. And again, of course, as the lecture proceeds, for every point you will have more. For example, when you write medicinal plants, okay, and when you are done with paper 2B, okay, so then you can also write the, let's say, the scientific name of all the medicinal plants. In fact, if I'm not wrong, in 2021 they asked you to write down 10 names, okay, of these medicinal plants. Fine. So these are the benefits of a forest, I think you should be able to understand. Fine. And if you had a content like this, I think in 2022 a question had come, forests are the best case studies for economic excellence. So people with forestry optional or who have good knowledge of forests can borrow a lot of points and mold it even for essay as well, right? Again, few points which may be not there, for example, chemical, medicinal products, water, right, photosynthesis, right, carbon storage, purification of air, water, climate regulation, right, flood mitigation. We have read about all of this, right? So it will be better if you write it in these 4 heads, okay? You can also write it in terms of what are the tangible benefits and what are the intangible benefits, because in intangible, a lot of, let's say, cultural and different supportive activities can come, okay? But I think a better way is this, because this is as per the ecosystem services. So 4 points can be there. In fact, my tip for you will be, again, if you get what are the benefits of mangroves, you can also write provisioning, cultural, supportive, regulating. The examiner will also see you have very good structured answers. Fine. These are the benefits of a forest. Okay. Now again, highlighting more benefits of forest. This is the State of the World's Forest Report 2022. This is the most updated. Fine. I will be referring to this report in different cases. Let's say when I have to talk about forest fires or degradation, again I'll refer this. Right now I'm talking about benefits of forest. Fine. So remember this phrase, okay? And I'll also tell you how to be smart to use content. See, forest pathways for what? Green recovery, building inclusive, resilient and sustainable economies. Okay, inclusive, resilient, sustainable. Okay, keyword for us becomes IRS. Again, one more thing, throughout my lectures I'll also tell you a lot of mnemonics. Okay, make good use of that and you will never be short on content. Okay, so if you have to write anything on the benefit of forest, always use this: inclusive, resilient and sustainable economies, green recovery. So from here the only takeaway is IRS and green recovery. Now this report has some chapters. So if I only see the headings of these chapters, what can I get? And this again tells me the important role which forests play. Fine. They provide means for recovery. I think this you already know. Inclusive, resilient and sustainable. So green IRS. This is one. Second, they provide vital goods and ecosystem services. Okay. And they are undervalued. Now ecosystem services you already know: provisioning, regulating, cultural and supportive. Okay, so PRCS or in whatever way if you want, but remember these 4. Okay, then they have interrelated pathways. I think this term you already know: green recovery and transition to sustainable economies. Okay, so green recovery we have already known. Fine. Then one thing which always will be there, that we have to invest a lot in the forests. Okay, so one is the investment is needed. Fine. Now this part is also very important and by the way, all these terms, for example, all these 6 chapters will be very useful. Let's say when I talk about in paper 1, afforestation, agroforestry, social forestry, joint forest management. Don't you think so? Tribology. So we will be using some relevant portions from here as well, right? So this is how we use the most updated current affairs, right? Which is the USP of Sunya as well. So smallholders, local communities, indigenous people are very important for implementation of these forest pathways. Okay, so this image or infographic will tell you how to think about forests. So it is not just one dimension. All right. So how can you create green recovery and resilient economy? So just use the phrases which are useful for you. Fine. The idea is to pack in or get the maximum marks out of whatever efforts we put in. Fine. State of the World's Forest Report. I'm pretty sure because you guys have cleared your prelims or perhaps will be clearing of prelims of 2024 as well. So this report is published by Food and Agriculture Organization. In fact, with respect to forest, FAO plays a very important role. In fact, in the end of the lecture, I'll tell you about the World Forestry Congress. Okay. So there as well, FAO plays a very important part. Fine. Now let's say if you get a question, and let us imagine if there's a question on the role of the forests. You can also get this question in your general, let's say, studies paper. You have English, you have GK, and then you have 2 optionals. So there also you can use it. And in this, now when you use it, also try to quote this report and perhaps use some phrases from the report. So you can write FAO's report, World's Forest of this 2022, talks about bringing green recovery, etc., etc. That will be helpful, right? Now we have understood what is forests. Now we should see what is forestry. Okay, so forestry is what? It is the science, okay, and the craft of managing, planting, using, conserving, repairing forests and woodlands for human and environmental benefits. So this is not a very difficult definition. And again, there are many definitions for forestry, but this I found was relatively simpler to use. Okay, so you have creating, managing, planting, using, conserving and repairing. You don't have to remember the exact sequence. Perhaps even if you write similar, or let's say 3 or 4 of these keywords, that is good enough. But yes, this is the science and the art. Okay, similarly, when we seek silviculture, it is also the science and the art, okay, for human benefits as well as environmental benefits, that is there. Okay, now when we discuss about forestry, we will now see the classification. Okay, so when I see the classification, or when I see the types of forestry, now these kind of mind maps should be very clear to you. So when you are watching the lecture, I encourage you to draw it like this, okay, and after the lecture try to draw it without seeing it, okay, because not just this, I have even more, let's say, consolidated mind maps as I go along. Fine. So first of all, you have protection forestry, you have production forestry, similar names but you have a difference, social forestry and urban forestry. Okay, now these two, from the name itself you can think what is protection going to be. The protection forestry has the basic aim, okay, about conserving your natural resources. So when you are planting trees or forests, etc., for the purpose of reducing, let's say, pollution. Okay, so any, let's say, goal which is linked to protection is the objective of protection forestry. Fine. Similarly, when I'm talking of production, think economics. Protection, think environment. Okay, so there can be commercial forestry and there can be industrial forestry here as well, right? So whatever we are doing, at least solely for the purpose of commerce and, let's say, management and generation, that is going to be commercial forestry, right? Then the second question can be, what is basically then what is commercial and what is industrial, right? So that is one part, the way in which we define this. Okay, then when I go to social forestry, okay, and by the way, you also would have read about social or urban forestry in your GS prelims and also GS mains for civil services as well. Social forestry simply is when you are including, let's say, the people as well in forestry, the social forestry, right? So you have farm forestry, right? There is recreational forestry, extension forestry and restoration of degraded forest. Okay, now in your margins, with restoration of degraded forest, please write down a term, Bond challenge. We'll see what this is in the end of the lecture. Write this on the margins. Restoration of degraded forest. Now think of desertification, degradation, etc. So if we want to restore the degraded forest, of course, how we can do that? We can talk about afforestation, reforestation. We'll also see what is the difference between afforestation and reforestation in lecture number 2. Okay, but for the time being, restoration of degraded forest is social forestry. Social forestry is basically also concerned about how, just a second, yeah, how can you ensure inclusivity? How can we talk about improving livelihoods also, because we're talking of social. So local communities doing forestry, that can also use to generate employment, livelihood. So all of this is a part of social forestry. And again, I've told you social forestry is a separate part in paper 1B. Okay. Extension forestry. What is that? Forestry is basically talking about plantations. So you have avenue plantations, you have commercial plantations, right? So that is there. In fact, you have read about plantations, you would have also read about eucalyptus. Okay. So eucalyptus being used by a lot of state governments. Now there are two things with respect, let's say, with respect to eucalyptus. One, it can absorb a lot of water. So especially in the cases when you have a, let's say, river or water sources, you have a lot of plantation with the idea that it will absorb the excess water. But the negative side is that it drains or guzzles a lot of water. So this disturbs the agroclimatic, let's say, zone, because of consumption of more water from its end. Okay, so just understand these kind of terms which we are discussing, right? Then what is farm forestry? Again, we're linking basically the farming aspect and the farmer part to the forestry, right? Again, a similar term utilizing this is agroforestry, right? That also we'll see in more detail in 1B. But again, this is respect to forestry, so you should understand, yes, protection, production forestry, right? Now, recreational forestry. Okay? In recreational, think of the aesthetic value of a forest. Okay, think of ecotourism benefits with which the forests can provide. Okay, think about sacred groves, etc. So all that will be a part of recreational forestry, right? I think in extension forestry, I already told you, you can write down road plantations, you can write down canal plantations. Fine. Urban forestry, right? Urban forestry. Now, before I tell you urban forestry, think of any urban area. Urban areas, number one, have limited land, huge population pressure, a lot of utilization of land and land use change. So they have very less land actually available for, let's say, plantation of forest. Fine. So the forestry activities which are suited for the urban areas will be urban forestry. And the most hot topic of urban forestry is what? Miyawaki method. Okay. Now this term again gained very much prominence because very recently our honorable Prime Minister spoke about this Miyawaki method in the Man Ki Baat. So this is a Japanese method of creating dense urban forest in a very small area. Fine. So he basically spoke about a Kerala-based teacher who used this technique. So now whenever you write about urban forest, definitely mention Miyawaki. You can get half mark extra. Now I'm just also highlighting the benefits of Miyawaki method. We'll also discuss this about in paper 1B. But again, you can use some of these points to tell the benefits or types of forestry. And also you can use these points again in the role of forests. To understand how you can use different content in different headings. Okay. The biggest benefit of Miyawaki method is it helps you in very rapid forest development. Fine. Normally what happens, let's say if you go for plantation of, let's say, a deciduous, let's say for teak. Okay. Teak is what? Please write it like this. Every lecture I'll ensure I'll talk about some of the scientific names as well. So let's say Tectona grandis. It can be anything. Acacia catechu, Acacia nilotica, so on and so forth. Fine. So generally speaking, so when I'm talking of let's say a deciduous or let's say a normal forest, it takes a lot of time. Okay. The regeneration or let's say the rotation period for this is very high. So it can take up to 100-150 years to grow basically. Okay, this is just to give you an example. But in Miyawaki, you can achieve the same thing within a very short span of time, within 15 to 20-25 years. So number one, you are saving time. Okay. Second, it has a lot of high biodiversity in its region. That also helps, right? It helps in enhanced carbon sequestration. Now that is also very helpful because these two portions are linked. Forests generally help you in carbon sequestration, and this helps you in more carbon sequestration, right? Then you have noise and air pollution. Okay, so noise and air pollution can be reduced because they can generally also be reduced. I also spoke about this when I talked about the role of forests here as well, right? Then it can help you in improving the soil quality. Okay, in also sustainable water management and regulating the surface temperature. Now, when I discuss the ecophysiological characteristics, I will explain all these terms. Okay, climatic, edaphic, biotic, so on and so forth. So we will be discussing the role of frost, radiation, temperature. Okay, so that perhaps will be covered in lecture 3 and lecture 4. But I hope you are able to understand, number one, how to write points okay, because this is just the first class and we will be discussing all these components through these mind maps and very interactive slides. Fine. So this is just to talk about the most hot topic in urban. So again, in your notes, write down perhaps Miyawaki method as an example. And this is just one example because urban forestry is not just Miyawaki method, by the way. So this is how, again, protection, production, social and urban. Okay. Again, I'll just say, just pause the lecture. I'm giving you 10 seconds. Again, try to recall all the examples I've given you. What is protection, production, what is social and what is urban. Okay. So I hope you are able to understand this in terms of types. Okay. Now these types can again be classified in a different way. For example, if you have objectives of management, that can be a different classification, but this is a general classification of the types of forestry which are done. Okay. So I hope this part is clear. Protection part, production, social and urban. I hope this part is clear. Okay. Now we move to the next part. This is the classification of forests. Okay. Now number one, the forests are being classified into various ways. So right from age, methods of regeneration, growing stock, ownership, ecological is also there. Okay. Objectives of management, legal status. So there are many ways in which the forests are classified. So number one, you know about these ways in which forests are classified. One. Okay. Before I go into this, and by the way, again here, for example, you have a term known as growing stock. Okay. Now again, growing stock, I will talk about this in the anatomy of a forest. You will understand what this is. Composition and age also, you will also understand in lecture number 2. But this is dealt in a lot of detail in paper 2A, which basically is about forest management. So again, you can understand the linkages of even silviculture, which is paper 1, part A, and that first topic with various other parts. Fine. So one by one, I'll start. But before doing this, a question should come to your mind. So what is the need of classifying the forest? Okay. Even before I tell you what is the need, you should try to think of some points. How will it help you? Why should we actually classify forests? And why is this to be done in so many different ways? The answer lies is that there are different parts, different regions, different climatic zones. And you cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach. That is the whole idea. This is a scientific discipline, forestry. The whole idea of classification is to understand and have different solutions for different areas, right? Now we'll see one by one. Okay. Now in these kind of, let's say, points, I have also given you a very good comprehensive list, which is why I'm telling you, you don't need to refer anything beyond. Fine. What is the need of classification of forests? If you only read this part, you will understand. Okay. Because even this is good enough. Fine. And I have given you 11 points, more than sufficient. So we'll start. Ecological understanding, that is the most basic part. So this helps you in the ecological understanding, right? So in which ecosystem something is to be used? Okay. What are the, so if you actually are able to classify, then you can tell me, okay, in this, let's say, tundra biome or this ecosystem, you should these kind of forests. Okay. If you have to have a plantation in, let's say, the calcareous or the hard pan regions of India. Okay, let's say. So what is to be done? So an example. Then it helps you identify and protect the sensitive areas, and it also helps you prioritize the conservation efforts. So in terms of conservation prioritization, it also helps. Then in terms of resource management also, it will help you. Okay, because if you don't know which plantation is to be done or which species is to be done in which area, it will lead to a lot of wastage. For example, again, in subsequent lectures, we will talk about afforestation in difficult areas. Okay. For example, if you think of the ravines of Chambal, which species has to be planted? Okay, so if you generally plant a normal species which is run in plains in that area, again, that will be a problem. So that will be an issue. Okay. Now, I will, in the subsequent lectures, I'll also tell you very pinpointed examples. Right now, I'm giving you a broad understanding. I hope you understand that. Fine. Climate change mitigation, we don't have to understand beyond this. So this will we will identify the carbon rich forests. For example, Peatlands are extremely rich terrestrial sources of carbon. Let's say if I want to save that, so I should know here they are. Helps you in wildlife, let's say habitat designation. Okay, so there are different species even in that. Similarly, in ecosystem restoration, this can help you. It can help you. Now, this is very important in policy development. Now, let's say there is a legal definition, and let's say there is an ownership. Ownership can be of government. Ownership can be of private people. Okay, so that can also help you. Now, let's say the national forest policy talks about 33%. So that classification will help you in making a good broad-based policy. Fine. It also helps you in education and communication. That is how we are talking about. So let's say if I tell you different types of forests or different, like, let's say, portions, then you will also be able to understand. Other people, the conservation strategists, will also be able to understand this. International cooperation. So if you classify something and there are some standards set, then only we can have an international collaboration. Otherwise, for everybody, the forest will mean something different. The technical specification can be something different. Then how can FAO or World Forestry Congress come and, let's say, talk about conservation? And last is land use planning. Fine. So ultimately, making informed decisions. In fact, I can say making informed silvicultural practices, because that is the next topic. So all of this will be aided by the classification, right? So all of this will be considered, and these are helpful. That is why we are going for the classification of forests in the first place. Understand the need and then understand these parts. So they are classified as per the age, as per the methods of regeneration, as per the growing stock, okay, ownership, legal status. Now, there are few things you already, I have told you about. For example, I have told you ecological is what? For example, here we will discuss champion and safe classification. Fine. This I think you already know. Ownership also I think you can understand. Other than that, I'll tell you other areas. Ownership, who owns the forest, whether it is private, whether it is, let's say, the government. So basically that is the ownership part of it. Legal status. Now think of Indian Forest Act of 1927. Think of protected forest, reserved forest, revenue, or let's say village forests. So that is the legal status of that. In fact, you can also think of deemed forest, and again the Godavarman judgment in that case. Okay. So now one by one we will discuss about these, let's say, portions. Okay. Now this is also a very interesting topic if you have to let's say read about. Fine. So yeah, one second. Why is this stuck? Okay. Yeah. So if I'm talking of age-based classification, fine. You can have even aged and you can have uneven aged. Now I think the diagram will definitely tell you. Now you have a homogeneous distribution of forests here. Same, let's say the height they have gone up to. Whereas uneven age, you will also have smaller. So here this is the, let's say, height, this height, this height, and this height. So even if I don't tell you what exactly age means, I think uneven age and even age, you can understand what this basically is talking about. I hope you are able to get that, right? So in terms of even and uneven age, you can also understand this. Okay. And in fact, you also hear about, in this also case, regular and irregular forests here as well. Okay. So that is also one thing we so let's say read about. Fine. So here basically the idea is it is actually based on a concept. Again, in your margins, write down a term known as rotation period. Fine. So basically this I will cover in lecture number 2 in the anatomy. Actually, there is let's say if the age is less than the 25% of rotation period and more than 25% of rotation period, this is how I classify. I don't want to go into technicalities in this very lecture. That will be done in lecture 2. But I think just understand age-based classification. You have even aged and uneven aged. That is the basics that you can just think about. Okay. Then you have methods of regeneration. Again, 2 more terms. This again will be covered in lecture number 2, just to give you a gist of terms. Again, don't get bogged down. You will find a lot of technical terms. It's a technical optional, but all these terms will become very easy. Fine. Although coppice and high forest you will study more in this silviculture systems. We are talking of silviculture general, but still I will tell you what this basically means. Now, high forest is any simple forest grown through seeds. So if the regeneration happens through the use of seeds, it is known as a high forest. Fine. What is a coppice? Please see this image. Okay, let's say if you cut the forests from this side and the shoots grow, and from that again if you have a regeneration, that is known as coppice. The coppice can be of different, let's say standard coppice and different coppices. Again, that's a separate topic. We will see that in silviculture systems. But again, the method of regeneration is again a point of classification. High forest and coppice. Okay, just write down. Again, the whole idea to introduce these definitions in the first two lectures is to make you familiar. So after this, throughout the lectures, things will be very smooth for you. Okay. Then you can also have objectives of management. Okay. For example, you have a National Commission on Agriculture. Okay. So this basically in 1976, it spoke about protection forest, we already know. Production forest, we already know. Social, we already know. So this is also what is the objective of management. So they want to create, again, in your margins, please write down forestry. We have seen types of forestry, so this is similar. So you can also make that linkage. Okay, protection, production, social. Okay. In production, let's say you have valuable forests, you have mixed forests. Okay. Let's say you also have inaccessible and these kind of forests. So that can also be there. Okay. Now, one more thing, please write down. I think, and yeah. So this is National Commission on Agriculture. Please write down the National Forest Policy of 1952. This also classifies as per the objectives of management. The code word for that, that's how I remember, is PNTV. Okay. So here P is, of course, we already know, is the protection forest. N is your national forest. T is basically the tree land. And V is village. This is PNTV. Okay. And again, this is somehow similar to what we discussed in the Indian Forest Act of 1927, which talks about protected forests, reserved forest, and revenue/village forests, right? So PNTV is National Forest Policy of 1952, which talks about again the objectives of management and how it classifies it. Already you have a National Commission on Agriculture, which talks about protection, production, and forest. Fine. And don't worry if you think you are getting a lot of, let's say, content in one go. With the time, you will be able to internalize all of this. All right. Fine. Now again, because I referred to the National Forest Policy, again referring or going back to, let's say, the Indian State of Forest Report, there you have very dense forest. See, what is a forest? As per that, greater than 1 hectare of land, canopy density greater than 10%. If the canopy density is greater than 10% and if the land is greater than 1 hectare, there can be many cases like canopy density is 70% and above, very dense forest. Moderately dense is 40% to 70%. 10% to 40% is open forest, and lastly is your scrub forest. Fine. And then of course is the non-forests, which is not included in this very case. Okay. So first of all, I hope you are able to understand this part here as well. Okay. Right. Now moving on. Okay, this is what we have just understood. Plants not included. Scrubs are the degraded forest with the canopy density. Now this is less than 10%. Fine. This is also a way of classification. All right. The forest cover, the target, of course, you already know, is 33%. But what is our current? So as per the 2021 report, we are forest and tree cover is 24.62. So forest is different and tree here is different. All right. Okay. Now we are talking of growing stock. I told you that growing stock is a slightly technical topic, which is the part of 2A, but still we'll see what is growing stock. So it is basically talking of the total volume of the live trees, which includes commercial as well as non-commercial, okay, which have reached a certain size or a diameter. Now this term again and again we will see, especially in paper 2, diameter at breast height, okay, and we'll also see very shortly that why is, let's say, height, or let's say how do you calculate the age, what is the relevance of height, etc., right? Now this is important, a very key indicator of the capacity or the productive capacity of forest. Fine. So that is there, and how much yield is going to be, and this is actually including the species, age, class, size, etc. So you also divide your forests as per the growing stock as well. Okay. So for now, you should just know it is a very important, or let's say a very critical concept. Okay. And here just remember, you divide the forest as a normal forests and as a abnormal forest. Now when you write this in your guidelines, please write down a term, the trinity of norms. There are 3 factors or 3 things which are making a normal forest, which we'll see in lecture number 2 in the anatomy. Okay, what are the 3 things? For example, you also have 3 pillars, let's say, of RBI, or 3 pillars of everything. Out of them, of course, one is growing stock, but there are 2 other things which we'll discuss in lecture number 2. Because for that, I'll just tell you perhaps in a diagrammatic way. But here, just remember that we have to, in the growing stock, the whole idea, because you have to talk about harvesting rate, rotation periods, and the idea is sustainable forest management. So that is why we talk of growing stock, which divides the forest into normal as well as abnormal. Okay. Now, you also have a ecological classification of forests. Okay. Now, ecological classification, of course, we'll talk about the Champion and State classification, okay, which was given in the year 1968. Champion and State classification basically talks about 5 major groups, okay, which in themselves also have total 16. Okay. Now here itself, please write along as I am going to write it. Okay. In that way, I am pretty sure you will be able to remember that. Fine. So very easily we can write down, let's say this is 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Okay. So one by one, and if you write, because you can also get a direct question on this part, so I don't want you people to miss out on this. So we will start with, I think I should use another, yes. Number 1 is tropical. Okay, first we will fill the 5 heads and then we will fill the relevant details as I go along. Okay, so 1 is tropical, second is subtropical. I think this terms you already know, tropics, subtropics, all right. Then third is, after tropics, what do you have? Temperate. Then you have subalpine, and then you have alpine. So first of all, please write this. Okay, tropical, subtropical, temperate, subalpine and alpine. Now, I am not filling things here right now. I am just telling you, let's say if I am talking of evergreen, so you will have moist and dry, deciduous also moist and dry. Okay, then you also have littoral and swamp forest, which are basically your mangroves. Fine. So now I'm just going to fill the points here one by one. Okay, and you will also understand how to understand this part. Okay, so for example, I will first write down, just give me a second, I will use another pen. Okay, and I'm leaving some space deliberately. You should also leave some space. Okay, so let's say if I'm writing evergreen. Okay, again I'm writing evergreen. So one will be, let's say, dry, one will be semi. Okay, one, two, 3. And why am I writing it? I did not directly give you I can also present this as an image, but this will prevent you from actually understanding and writing it in one go. Okay, now I am highlighting one part here. You have to remember this because this will be very helpful. this is very important. Littoral and swamp, which is 4. So whenever now you read about mangroves, and which I'll cover in the subsequent topic, mangroves and cold desert, we will see it is group 4. So that is littoral and swamp is going to be covered here. Okay, fine. Again, the deciduous one is pending. I've already told you one will be let's say moist and one will be dry, so that is let's say easy for us to write about it. Okay, now one by one I'll be filling it. Now this is very easy to understand. Okay, so when I'm writing off, this is wet evergreen. Okay, then you have semi evergreen. Again, if I have to write about the deciduous, one will always be moist, one will be dry. Thorn forest, you already know, think of thorns and think of deserts. Okay, now the last one is evergreen, so this is dry. So you have wet evergreen, semi evergreen and dry evergreen. You have moist deciduous, dry deciduous, and you have thorn. And this 4 is very important, that is littoral and swamp. Total 16 are there, we've covered 7. Okay, so I will now be filling other areas as well, so you can easily understand it. Why are we spending time on it? Because for forestry optional you should write. By the way, all this is going to be covered separately in, I think, perhaps like lecture number 6 or 7, around that, when I discuss the forest types in India. Then for every type we'll also discuss the species, subtype, because that is let's say going to be covered later on. But still, this portion after this class, if I ask you, you should be able to write down all of this. Okay, and perhaps when we have our Zoom sessions, I can ask you this separately and individually as well. So make sure you understand this. Okay, so that is going to be there. Again, for example, you have alpine, so write moist alpine, and you can write dry alpine, right? So again, if you have, let's say, subalpine, so in this you don't have any other component, this only is one component here. Now again, when I'm thinking of temperate, okay, so you have again 3 cases here: wet, moist and dry. Okay, so 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Fine. So only 3 are again present in, or let's say left in subtropical. Fine. So here you can write about is your basic broadleaf, then you have pine. Okay, so one is broadleaf, the other is pine, and then the last one which is supposed to be highlighted here is your, again, the dry evergreen. Okay, so these are overall the classifications that are, I should write it here. Okay, so this is 7, this is 1, 2 and 3. If you want, you can write down from 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 and then till 16 you can follow that. Okay, otherwise individually also you can just try to remember this. Okay, so this is basically mountain, subtropical, let's say dry evergreen forest, mountain, subtropical. Okay, so in many cases it is also mentioned like this, right? So this is one thing I've deliberately spent time here so that you're able to understand the ecological classification. Fine. Now, one small homework for you. I think you have seen this in your basic geography, let's say. Okay, so just try to identify and see the locations. Think of tropical areas and just go through this, so that when I'm going to cover it in the relevant lecture, this becomes easy. Okay, so I'm just marking this a small part as homework, but we'll be covering it separately. But I want you guys to have an understanding. Okay, and through our lectures you will understand, for example, what are, let's say, pine, what is broadleaf, what is evergreen, deciduous, etc. We'll also cover that separately. Okay, but just for the understanding, evergreen does not have a separate season in which it shed leaves. Okay, whereas in deciduous there is a separate season, the leaves are shed. Okay, so that is one thing that you have to understand. Again, just a small thing I want to add here. When we are classifying as per ecology, okay, so this is basically done in terms of the availability of rainfall. Okay, so when you have abundant rainfall, okay, then you have the formation of forests. Just also understand this part here as well. You have forest, you have grasslands, and you have the desert. From forests to desert, the rainfall definitely will decrease. Now, if you get a question and perhaps in prelims UPSC has already asked you why forests are not able to grow in a grassland. The reason is you don't have adequate amount of water or basically precipitation which is required in a forest. Forests can be now tropical, subtropical, etc. And in that you can have, I told you, evergreen and deciduous. This I'm just telling you, this is very basic, even covered in your NCERT of class 7th, but just to develop your basics. Fine. Evergreen will be shedding leaves throughout the year. They don't have a specific season or time. Whereas in deciduous, let's say they shed their leaves specifically in the summer. That is why they are deciduous. Okay. Now, when I'm talking of grasslands, grasslands can also be tropical and temperate. Of course, temperate grasslands will have even lesser rainfall. You will have a lot of grazing animals which will do a lot of grazing activities. And when I'm talking of deserts, of course, these are very harsh, very less vegetation. Only will have, let's say, cactus or kind of things which are going to be present here. Less vegetation. By the way, we will also read about cold desert along with mangroves, so that will be separate. So we'll also understand the areas of Ladakh, Himachal, etc. Where you find cold deserts. Fine. So this also is one thing which is very important for you to understand. And then you can understand the champion and safe classification. Tropical, subtropical, mountain subtropical, temperate, subalpine and alpine. Okay. Now moving on to the next topic, and before I do that, again let me go back to this part here. Okay. So age wise, you know, even age, uneven age, methods of regeneration, high forest and let's say coppice. Growing stock also, we have read about normal and abnormal forest. Okay, there is one thing which is mentioned here as ownership. I think I have not specifically told you what will be present here. So in terms of ownership, you can just write down. So one can be government owned, one can be community owned. Okay, so there is one government, and of course one can be privately owned. And last, you can also be owned by panchayats. Okay, and I don't have to explain what this means. I think this is self-explanatory. Government ownership, community, private land, and the let's say the case of panchayats. Fine. Then you have legal status. Okay, I think legal status. Just remember the Indian Forests Act of 1927. Okay, if you remember that, that was going to be good enough. Okay, in which you basically have reserved forest, protected forests, revenue, or let's say village forests. I'll just tell you, if you just recapping your concepts, reserved forests have the highest degree of protection. Then protected forests have limited protection, whereas in revenue or let's say in the village forests, the villagers, etc., they have the full ownership. They can definitely sell and they can do a lot of, let's say, minor forest produce selling and a lot of activities. So that has the least degree of protection in that case. Objectives of management, I think I'm very sure you guys have understood objectives of management in terms of these two frameworks: National Forest Policy, PNTV, and this National Commission for Agriculture, Protection, Production and Social. Fine. So I think this part also you guys have understood. Okay. Okay, one thing also is composition. Fine. So just write down pure forests. Okay. And the second is mixed forest. Again, the same from the name itself. Pure forest is usually defined, it will have one species, or the one species more than 80% in the whole area. That is pure forest. Mixed is you have a mixture of species. Fine. And again, you can think of this diagram. Okay, if you have a single species which is occupying or more than 80%, that will be a pure forest. That is based on the composition. Otherwise, it will be uneven aged. All right. So I hope this part is also very clear to you. And last is ecological, which is champion and sage classification. Fine. Now spend some time on it because this usually takes some time to understand. Okay. So you might not get this entirely in one go. So watch the entire lecture, revise and re-revise, then you will understand it. However, many portions of this will again be referenced in throughout my lectures. So this is not the first time or the last time we are discovered, let's say, reading about it. Okay. Need you have understood. Now we go to silviculture. Okay. Again, I have mentioned few technical or scholarly definitions. Whatever definition you find best, you should use. It is defined as the process by which the crop constituting the forest is tended, removed and replaced by new crops. Fine. This is by R.S. Troop. It is a branch of forestry that deals with establishment, development, care and reproduction. Okay. Stands of timbers, etc. This is by James P. Turner. You don't have to quote the source. However, the second definition is one of the most quoted ones, and the key you can talk about is EDCR. Establishment, development, care and reproduction. Okay. And making some small codes like this definitely helps people like us. Okay. So you might not be knowing the exact sequence, but if you know EDCR, yes, establishment, development, care and this reproduction of timber. So you can just mention that, or you can make this definition even better, that silviculture is a scientific and an artful practice. Some people say that silviculture is the science and the art of maintaining forests. That, but you can just say that silviculture is the scientific branch of forestry, and again mention EDCR. Okay, practice of growing and cultivating trees. Primary objective is what? Just a second. This is actually okay. Ecological, economic and social goals aimed at managing the forest ecosystem. Now here this is important: economic, ecological and social goals. So even this is a good point for you to remember. So whatever suits the best to you, use that, but I'll say the mixture of this and this will give you a good definition on silviculture. So again, what you should do after this lecture, again in that key terms and sheet, your definition of forestry should be final. Your definition of silviculture should be final. So now when you, this is how you write better answers, because you already have a prepared introduction or definition. Okay. So this is silviculture. Now throughout this entire lecture series, we will see, this is basically how the regeneration and every cycle is, how from the basic seeds, saplings, then the forest and the degeneration, cutting, tending, all these operations go along, and this is what we are doing in agriculture. The whole idea is scientific management. Again, you also have an extractive benefit. You want to extract the maximum part of it. Although that extractive benefit was the sole purpose pre-independence. For independence, the objective of Britishers was to extract the maximum resources for it from India. This is why if you see the National Forest Policy of 1952, it is very extraction oriented. But as you see the National Forest Policy of 1988, then there have been changes. It also talks about livelihoods. It talks about the social dimensions of forestry. Now you can also link how the evolution of forestry has been: protection, production, then you have social and urban, right? So when you go through this and you understand it, then things will make sense. Fine. Then okay, this is how this is. Now I'm not asking you to remember this diagram right now. Just see this, and there are, for example, again, you might not understand, sir, what is hardwood forest? I don't know what is softwood. Okay, what is the first cut? What is regeneration? The terms which are used here. For terms, we will have this. I'm telling you, lecture number 2, anatomy of a forest. You watch it and treat that lecture as your visual dictionary. Okay, because there I am focusing only on the terms, so that from now when you see, it becomes very easy for you, and that lecture can also be updated. For example, I will have one part, but let's say if I find there are even more doubts which you people have, which you send me, I'll also make one small part of it as well, which can be, let's say, lecture 2.2. okay, that's the whole idea. Okay, this is how the cycle is going on. You will understand this more when we discuss, let's say, 2A. 2A is entirely about let's say forest management. You will understand this even more when you discuss silviculture systems with me. I told you high forest, coppice forest, because silviculture systems is actually going through all this. How can you have the various cutting methods, tending operations, etc., to maximize the generation of timber? Again, that is linked to forest economics as well, right? That is the whole idea behind silviculture. Fine. Again, you get a question, sir, why are, let's say, what are the objectives of silviculture? I also told you what is the need of classification of forests. Similarly, you also have objectives of silviculture. So yeah, you can think of many objectives. Even before I show you the points, think of it. Pause the lecture here itself. Try to think of 4 or 5 points based on what I have discussed. Okay. Now, one benefit, of course, has to be maximum, or let's say good yield extraction. of silviculture. Second, again, would be scientific management. Third, I think, can be good resource utilization, so that I don't waste my forest and I also don't waste too much of water. Okay. Otherwise, if you see right now, many farmers or many people are not even aware of which forests or which areas is to be done. So sometimes the plantation activities are also not done as per the agroclimatic zones. This is why also I need to have a good silvicultural knowledge. Now, just think, if I want to introduce an exotic plant into India, we go to South America, we want to bring it. If I don't know the good knowledge of silviculture, we might not be able to introduce it in the best manner, right? Even from an ecological understanding point, you also need that. Fine. So now let us see the objectives of silviculture one by one. Okay. Again, I have added many points here. Number one is sustainable forest management. Okay. So we talks about long-term health for the productivity of our ecosystems. Okay. Again, ecological, economic, and social. Keep this definitely in your mind. Okay. Then ecosystem restoration. It plays a crucial role in restoring the degraded or disturbed for areas. So if there's a, for example, we will also see there are some silviculture practices, maybe they are not that efficient. Let's say if I talk of clear felling system, again, in your notes, in this, write down this term. This term will again reappear again and again in silviculture systems, clear felling systems, okay, so on and so forth. So how can I plant native tree species? That will help you. Improving the soil quality, better regeneration, that can also be very helpful, right? Timber production, how can this be made better, more sustainable? How can, one of the main goal is also to conserve biodiversity, which also means that I should not plant invasive tree species, okay? Because let's say if I talk about invasive tree species, many of them have been, for example, Lantana camara, etc. Okay, so they have been very detrimental to the growth. Okay, so we don't want to do that. Or let's say Russian poplar, etc. Right? So we want to create a mixed species stand. Why mixed? If I only go for one species stand, that does not promote biodiversity. Why we want to create a mixed species stand. Okay, wildlife habitat should be enhanced. Biodiversity should be conserved. Fine. It should help, or one of the ways is to, climate change will always be a dimension. Please remember that. Climate change. Carbon sequestration, it should also help there. Okay. It should help in soil and watershed protection, yes. In recreation and aesthetics, I'm not going into every nitty-gritty because these points are also self-explanatory and you can just go through the content which is there, right? Again, one of the objectives, now this is also very important, is research and innovation. Because the scientists or the forest scientists are just looking for improving the stands of forest, better utilization, reducing the growth time, etc. Okay, stand dynamics, ecological interactions, etc. So that is there. Again, very important objective is to improve the livelihoods, which is why again social dimensions of it, right? Pest and disease management, again this is there. In fact, you can also write point number 12. Introduction of exotic species. Now in your notes, all you should have is only these 12 points, just this, because the explanation part I'm very well confident you will be able to do. So now when you have to revise just these 12 small points, if you are able to remember, and when you remember 12, then in the exam you will write 6 or 8. Okay, so which is why if you say that, sir, you are giving us so much of content, the idea is, because even if I tell you 12 points, I'm not expecting you to write all 12. If you're able to, excellent, you get more marks, but still you will have very good content and you will never be short on content. Okay, so that is there. Again, the soil and the watershed protection is one of the core themes of paper 1B, in how this help you in preventing soil compaction, runoff, and then we'll also understand about shelter belts, wind breaks. How can you have some plantations at the coasts or general to have watershed protection, soil protection? All these things will also understand. How this helps you in maintaining microclimate. Okay, again, please write that down separately. What is microclimate? We'll also see this very shortly. That's again a keyword. Fine. So these are the objectives of silviculture, right? Now there are two more terms, what is silviculture and what is silvics. Okay, the only thing you have to know is that silvics is a part of silviculture. So let's say there are two things, right? Set and a subset. So silvics is a part of silviculture, and silviculture is actually the broad term. Okay, but even if, let's say, if you get a question on silvics, or perhaps if you get a question on differences between silviculture and silvics, you should be aware. This is why I've added this. Okay, so silvics is what? The art or the science and art of forestry, which is having EDCR. Okay, establishment, development, care and reproduction of timber stands, right? This is a smaller part. It is actually a part of the basic theory, okay, which is studying the life history and the general characteristics of forestries. Okay, so this has a practical and a specific application, which is why it is a smaller part of silviculture. Okay, so that is there. In this silviculture, you have both theory and practice. This is basically talking about practice part of it. Okay, so it talks about the study of trees and forests as biological units. Okay, and here, of course, you're talking of everything, and this is only one specific part. Okay, so that is basically how we understand the difference, okay, overall between silviculture and silvics. You can just go through this. Okay, I don't think there is anything else technical which I have to explain here. All right, so I think that is one part. Now we move on to the next part here, right? One second, why is this stuck? Okay, now this is very important. I want all of you to draw this diagram with your own hands. Not very difficult. In fact, if you understand, this is your entire forestry syllabus which is mentioned. Forest mensuration, paper 2A. Forest management, paper 2A. Forest protection, again generally covered in many areas. Forest finance, paper 2B. Forest economics, paper 2B. Forest utilization, again paper 2A. Okay, so silviculture is actually tied to all of this, and I've added only 6 spokes. You can create even more spokes. How? You can add more portions from your syllabus, add agroforestry, add tribology. Okay, so whatever you add, you can make it, but these are the 6 most important things: forest mensuration, management, protection, finance, economics, and utilization. Okay, so silviculture has a multifaceted application. For example, if you get what is the role of silviculture in promoting forestry, write down all of this and explain all of this. Forest mensuration, so we will see how you measure the, let's say, trees, because measurement of trees, diameter at breast height, etc., very important. Through that, a lot of plantation and different activities are done. So this is a technical portion also. This is very important, and this in general is one of the most important part. Forest management, because think of a government. Government has to ensure sustainable timber extraction. Government has to ensure livelihoods for the people. It cannot do without the knowledge of forest management. For that, they also create forest working plan. So all these things are essential. Forest protection, very important. Protection from, let's say, the smugglers. You have to have laws. Protection from wild animals. Protection from hunters. From, let's say, humans as well. And so many things. Forest finance also important. Forest economics, again, the valuation of forest, net present value, different things. And again, utilization. In terms of, you have different products, non-timber, timber products. In that also, different timber and lumbering operations. So all these things are connected. So you also are required to draw this. Draw this again. You have so many points, because from each of this, multiple points are going to come. That is how you're going to create points, right? And again, just see this, right? Everything is forestry or the silviculture has so many different branches. Again, you draw just like I have done. Okay, don't just think you will just use the PPT. I want you guys, even if you have to draw this exact, this is what? Syllabus in a mind map format. But again, if you do it like this and if you see it, you will make a lot of linkages. Okay, linkage number 1, linkage number 2, so on and so forth. So that is going to be helpful, right? Now I go to the last part of my lecture, and now I will tell you the linkage of climate change, deforestation, and forestry. Fine. In this, of course, you have the global forest goals. You have a United Nations Forum on Forests. They talk about how saving forest help you in achieving SDGs 8, but not just SDG 8. conservation of forests help you in achieving all the sustainable development goals. How? SDG 1 is what? Poverty. If you save the forests, the tribal communities and the people living by, they are also saved. So it will also help you reduction of poverty. It generates employment. It generates livelihood. It can also help you prevent hunger. So every SDG can also help you mitigate climate change. Climate change is SDG 13. It can also help you there. SDG 15 is life on land. So if you want to prevent desertification, go for afforestation. That is there. So forests help in inclusive, sustainable economic growth and employment. Okay, in the previous forest, let's say FAO report, we had seen the keyword IRS, green recovery and IRS. Again, add inclusive, sustainable economies and employment. This is IES. Okay, you will say, sir, you are just creating mnemonics from the government posts. One was IRS, IES. IES is inclusive, employment and sustainable economic growth. Okay. Then one more thing I have to tell you is this mainstreaming the biodiversity in forestry. Okay, this report had come out again by FAO. Okay, so this report simply says that for sustainable forest management, forests and the biodiversity have to go hand in hand. So in this first lecture, in your notes, just write down mainstreaming in biodiversity, FAO report. Okay, you also have organization CIFOR, okay, which is publishing it. Okay, and just write this part. Okay, because this I will cover in more detail in paper 1B. Then I will explain all these things. Okay, that how can you adopt a multi-sectoral perspective? How can forests help you in mitigation of climate change? Okay, why are they necessary and how they help? So all these part, in fact, of course, the slide or the content will be available with you, but we will go into more, let's say, understanding, deeper understanding. Why? Because if you see, yes, for paper 1B, environmental conservation and biodiversity, this is where I'm going to link this new report. Okay, but overall it talks about halting and reversing deforestation, combating illegal forest, let's say, activities, capacity development, so on and so forth. I'm not going to do a lot of detail here. Okay, and basically it's talking about mainstreaming biodiversity. So earlier biodiversity was not in the mainstream, it was at the outskirts of the periphery. So now what they're saying, if you want to conserve what we used to do, if I wanted to conserve the forest, I only thought of forest. So this basically report says that in your policies and action plans, conserve both biodiversity and forestry. So mainstream the biodiversity. If you mainstream biodiversity, it also helps you to protect the forest as well. Okay, so biodiversity should be integrated in policy, strategy and public to promote conservation of natural resources. That is the whole idea here. Okay, and again in your margins, please write down paper 1B and also the relevant section where we are going to cover it, that is environmental conservation and biodiversity. So you should also have these exact linkages. Okay, moving on, just a second. Actually the flying bees actually sometimes prevent us from using the whiteboard. Okay, and because I'm saying deforestation and because I'm saying climate change, etc., so you should also know, I told you to write down a heading, Born Challenge, in the initial part of the lecture. So what is Born Challenge? Born Challenge is basically an initiative by IUCN and the government of Germany, which talks about restoration of degraded lands and talks about afforestation. Okay, it has a global target and a target for India. Remember this because you are going to write this again and again. For global, you have to restore 350 million hectares. For India, you have to restore 26 million hectares, both by the year 2030. So Born Challenge again is talking about how can you protect and restore forest. Why? Because a lot of forests are, let's say, dying off. Again, a very good infographic to tell you, right? If we don't do it, a lot of destruction is going to happen. Fine. And again, what can happen, you can understand from the role of forest or the benefit of forest, I told you. Fine. So that is one thing that you have to understand. So that is why we need to urgently protect and, let's say, preserve our forests. All right. That is one thing that you have to understand. So that is how you have to understand this whole part. So mainstreaming the biodiversity of forestry, understanding this part is important. And then I will end the lecture talking about the Seoul Declaration. Okay, this was the most recent happening in the World Forestry Congress of the 15th World Forestry Congress. Okay, now this declaration has talked about the role of forests and forestry in addressing global challenges. One, and it also says there is a need of immediate action. Okay, please keep in mind we are talking of current context of huge degradation of land. It is saying you need to triple your investments for restoring degraded land. So now when you read about forest economics, forest conservation, always mention Seoul Declaration that you need to triple your investments to restore degraded land by 2030. All right, so that is there. It emphasizes international cooperation. One, okay, it says that carbon, water, energy cycle, of course we have read about in the ecosystem services of forest. Okay, only the keywords which I am highlighting, make note of it. Innovative technology, okay, evidence based decision making, effective forest communication, okay, new partnerships. So only the words which I am highlighting are useful. Okay, so that is there. And very important part is the close relationship between forest health and human well-being. Okay, to reduce the risk of future pandemics. So again, in your let's say benefit of forest, please add these points as well and link Seoul Declaration. Okay, you would have read about this in your prelims 2023. Okay, but still I'm just adding this here. Okay, so that is one. The year is this, need investment. Just add this part, reduce the risk of pandemics, relationship between forest health and human well-being. So I hope you are able to understand these portions. Fine. The portions I highlighted, I've just made a mind map also of this. Talks about international cooperation, forests being vital for biodiversity, and again we've discussed mainstreaming biodiversity part. Innovative technology, new partnerships, close relation between forest and human beings, reducing the risk of pandemics, and sustainable wood, because we just simply don't want to extract timber in an unsustainable manner. Think of sustainable wood. Okay, again you have a platform REDD plus, we will discuss this about in 1B, okay, and in 2B as well. Reducing the emissions from deforestation and degradation, REDD and REDD plus. Also this, please write this in your margins as well, because these kind of let's say initiatives are very famous worldwide. If you write them down, examiner will definitely appreciate your hard work. All right, and this is the final, let's say the main takeaway. This declaration urges responsibility should be integrated and not just of the government. So institutions, sectors, stakeholders should take responsibility, and they should transcend political, social and environmental boundaries. It's a very important takeaway for all of us. Okay, so that is the main part here. Okay, now I'll just quickly show some previous year questions for you, and you can answer some of them based on what we've discussed. So number one, let's say justify that the study of silvics is essential for successful afforestation in India. Now you will see, sir, I have not directly read it. Of course, we will see this in a relevant lecture, but if you remember the objectives of silviculture, this you can borrow points, because the question is saying if you want to carry a successful afforestation program, study of silvics, I gave you 12 points. So the relevant points you can take from here, and you can give examples. Kambal, you cannot simply plant a tree or let's say any variety which is present in a plain. So from that you can try to generate points, because see, this is the first class. I'm just encouraging you, those of you who want to pen down and just generate some points. Very shortly after subsequent classes, you will have a lot of content. Now, second question I am expecting everybody to write. Those of you who are more eager can even write the question and send it to me. Define silviculture, you already know. Relate the applications of silviculture to different branches of forestry. See that diagram, 6 dimensions, add more dimensions. Explain it. It can be a short answer, it can be a long answer. Very easy. Legal definition of forests in India. Write about the major forest types in India, champion and set classification. Okay, so you can mention that. And even before you define, you can just say there is a legal, technical, and let's say ecological definition, and you can just mention that. You can even mention, for example, What is Ministry of Environment and Forest Climate Change saying about the definition? You can add it here. Even if you want to go a step further, add the Goda Varman judgment as well. Forests have a moderating impact on soil and water temperature. Now, this is a separate topic when we'll discuss the eco-physiological characteristics, but still the theme of the question is related to the benefits which the forest provides. Benefits you've already seen. So still try to write 4 or 5 points based on whatever you know. They have a moderating impact on soil. How? Think. We will, of course, soil I am going to cover when I discuss edaphic factors, but still I encourage you to think. Okay. So before I end the class, I'll just tell you what all we have done so far, because I always revise what all we have done. So we started the lecture understanding basically about forests. Okay. The distribution of forests globally. What is forest and what is the jungle? Jungle was the untouched by human habitations. Technical, legal, and ecological definitions. Okay, different laws which governs the forest in India. Benefits of forest. Here, remember, provisioning, supporting, regulating, and cultural. 4 dimensions. State of the word forest. We saw the mnemonic IRS: inclusive, resilient, and sustainable economies and green recovery. Okay. What is forestry? You know the definition now. Types: protection, production, social, and urban. Okay. In urban, we saw the Miyawaki method. Classification of forest. Now, what I am saying, I just want to see how creative you people are, and after that, I'll also tell you my mnemonic to remember it. Okay. So these are 8 ways in which how you can classify a forest. What you can do, you can just try to create a mnemonic so that all these 8 are always present with you. The idea to generate codes or mnemonic is this only. Okay. That, okay. Then we also understood, just give me a second, I think the keyboard, yeah. Classification of forests. We have seen around 10 or 11 points, just we revise that. Age-based classification, method of regeneration, objectives. Now this is as per the canopy density. Okay, growing stock, ecological classification. Then what is silviculture? We saw that, right? Then what the objectives of silviculture? We saw difference between silviculture and silvics also we saw. Overall applications and connections with forestry. Then we linked it. Then we linked it to climate change. Okay, why should mainstreaming biodiversity in forestry should be considered? The urgent need to conserve and restore forest and the Seoul Declaration, right? That is all we've covered. And then we saw few previous questions. And as I'm done with at least 3 or 4 lectures, then I'll discuss all the previous questions in more detail. That you also have sufficient points. But still this and this, I expect you to write good answer on. Okay. And then the last part, your homework. Please read about the Goda Varman judgment. Okay. Second, write down all the technical terms and examples which I discussed in this lecture in a separate page. This will be very handy when we end the lecture. Okay. Follow what I'm telling you, and you will be definitely rewarded in your mains. Champion and sage classification. First, the 5 broad groups, and within that, the 16. Practice it 2 or 3 times. It takes some time to get it in your, let's say, nerves. Then it becomes easy. Do this, and I can ask anybody of you in your Zoom sessions to do it or tell it to me exactly. Okay, so do it, not just because I'm asking you to do it, but for yourself. And last is, because I've just introduced forestry as an optional for you. Right now in the current affairs, the Lok Sabha, you would have read about it, the Lok Sabha conservation, this forest conservation rules of 2 being passed. Fine. So read about this also. Fine. So that is there. Now, when we meet in lecture number 2, we will discuss the anatomy of forest in good detail. A lot of keywords, terms. Okay, so that will make things easy. And then from lecture number 3, we will talk about the eco-physiological, let's say, the characteristics of forests. In that, location factors, site factors, climatic factors, edaphic factors, that we will discuss. Okay, this is just to tell you so that you are always excited to attend the next class. Fine. So again, please revise. This is your first lecture. If you found that there was a lot of content, please be patient. Break this down. First lecture in maybe 1 or 2 go. Revisit if needed, and always feel there is any doubt, you can contact at forestry_Sunya. I'll reply to all of you. Fine. So with that said, I hope you enjoy this lecture and take a lot of value out of it. I'll meet you very shortly in lecture number 2. Thank you.